The world saw Lou Reed as rock's untouchable poet, the man who turned feedback into philosophy and heroin into hymns. But on a cold Berlin night in 1998, something cracked. The spotlight hit him. The opening chords of Perfect Day began, and thousands of fans watched as the notorious New York street poet's voice trembled, his hands shook, and tears he couldn't hide rolled down his weathered face. The audience thought it was the beauty of the song. They were wrong. What happened backstage 30 minutes before that performance would reveal the devastating truth about Rachel, about the electroshock treatments that haunted him for decades, and about the real meaning behind those deceptively simple lyrics everyone thought they understood. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, please subscribe to support our channel as we bring you the hidden truths behind rock's greatest legends. The year was 1998, and Lou Reed was 56 years old, standing at a crossroads between his brutal past and an uncertain future. He had survived the Velvet Underground's commercial failure that became cultural prophecy, weathered the glam rock transformation with David Bowie, endured the Metal Machine music backlash that nearly destroyed his career, and outlasted a heroin addiction that should have killed him a dozen times over. But nothing in his arsenal of survival mechanisms had prepared him for what he was about to face on that Berlin stage. The concert was part of a European tour, intimate venues deliberately chosen after years of stadium performances. Reed wanted something different now, something that felt less like spectacle and more like confession. His manager had noticed the change weeks earlier. The way Lou would sit alone in hotel rooms staring at photographs he never showed anyone. The way certain songs now required longer sound checks, not for technical reasons, but because Reed needed time to compose himself before performing them. The afternoon before the Berlin show, Lou had received a phone call in his dressing room. The details of that conversation would remain private for years, locked away in the testimonies of his sound engineer and tour manager, who were present but sworn to silence. What emerged later, through careful reconstruction of events and discreet interviews, painted a picture that made Reed's on-stage breakdown not just understandable, but inevitable. The call had come from New York, from someone connected to his past in ways that cut deeper than any critic's review or any parent's disappointment ever could. It concerned Rachel Humphreys, the transgender woman who had been Lou's companion, lover, and muse during some of his most creatively fertile and personally chaotic years in the early 70s. Rachel had disappeared from Reed's life in ways that remained deliberately vague, the kind of absence that celebrity biographies glossed over with phrases like, "they parted ways," or "the relationship ended." But relationships don't just end. People don't just disappear. And Lou Reed's deliberate silence about Rachel for over 2 decades suggested a wound that had never properly healed. The phone call brought news that Rachel had been located, living in circumstances that were described by those who knew as heartbreaking. The details were sparse but devastating, a life that had spiraled after Lou had cut off contact, after the fame and the parties and the factory scene had evaporated like morning mist in harsh sunlight. Reed had spent years building walls around that part of his past, refusing interviews about Rachel, deflecting questions with sarcasm or outright hostility. He had crafted a carefully controlled narrative about his life, one that acknowledged his bisexuality and his experimental years, but kept Rachel at a safe, abstract distance. Now, hours before he was scheduled to perform, those walls were crumbling. His tour manager later recalled Lou sitting on the edge of a worn leather couch, holding the phone long after the call had ended, staring at nothing in particular while the afternoon light through the dressing room window turned from gold to gray. What the audience settling into their seats that evening couldn't possibly know was that Perfect Day had never been the simple love song it appeared to be. Written in 1972, during the peak of Reed's relationship with Rachel and the depths of his heroin use, the song carried layers of meaning that shifted depending on where Lou's mind was when he performed it. Sometimes it was genuinely about a perfect day spent in the park. Sometimes it was dripping with irony, a junkie's last good high before the inevitable crash. Sometimes it was about Rachel, about stolen moments of normalcy in lives defined by chaos and marginalization. And sometimes, like tonight in Berlin, it became something else entirely. A reckoning, a confession, a prayer to a God Lou didn't believe in for forgiveness he didn't think he deserved. The concert began routinely enough. Reed stalked onto stage in his characteristic black leather jacket and ever-present sunglasses, the armor he had worn since the Velvet Underground days when Andy Warhol had taught him that mystique was as important as music. The opening songs were tight, professional, the band locked in behind him while Lou delivered his trademark speak-singing style, that half-spoken, half-sung delivery that had influenced everyone from David Bowie to Patti Smith to every punk band that came after. The Berlin crowd was enthusiastic but respectful, the kind of European audience that treated rock concerts like cultural events rather than mere entertainment. They knew they were in the presence of history, this man who had written Heroin and Walk on the Wild Side, who had survived everything the 60s and 70s could throw at him and emerged with his artistic integrity somehow intact. But as the set progressed, those close to the stage began noticing something unusual. Reed was drinking more water than normal, pausing longer between songs, removing his sunglasses more frequently to wipe at his eyes in a gesture that could have been sweat but seemed like something else. His guitar tech, a veteran of dozens of Reed tours, caught his eye during one song transition and saw something he had never seen before: uncertainty. Lou Reed, the man who had stared down record executives and told them to go to hell, who had released an album of pure feedback noise just to spite his label, who had never apologized for anything in his life, looked uncertain. Then came Perfect Day. The setlist had it positioned in the middle of the concert, a strategic placement that allowed for emotional resonance without overwhelming the show's momentum. The lighting designer, following the plan they had used for weeks, brought the stage lights down to a single amber spot on Reed. The band fell silent. Lou stepped to the microphone with his acoustic guitar, and for a moment, everything was exactly as it had been at every other show on the tour. But when the first chord rang out, something fundamental shifted. Reed's right hand, the one that had coaxed sounds from guitars that other musicians couldn't imagine, trembled visibly. His voice, when it came, carried a crack in the first line that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with the call he had received hours earlier. The audience noticed but misinterpreted. They thought it was artistic choice, emotional authenticity, the kind of raw vulnerability that separated great performers from merely competent ones. They didn't know that Lou was seeing Rachel's face behind his closed eyelids, remembering a real, perfect day spent in Central Park in 1973. Rachel in a dress and heels that turned heads, Lou daring anyone with his eyes to say something, both of them floating on a combination of love and substances that made the world seem softer than it actually was. They didn't know that the line about being glad he spent it with you was hitting Lou with the weight of decades of regret. That the seemingly simple lyrics were transforming in real time into an apology he had never made, a recognition he had never offered, an acknowledgement that he had taken someone who trusted him and discarded them when the relationship became inconvenient for his career and his carefully constructed image. As the song progressed, The trembling in Reed's voice became undeniable. By the second verse, tears were visible on his face, catching the amber stage light as they traced paths down his weathered cheeks. His sunglasses, his eternal shield, sat unused on top of the amplifier behind him. He was exposed, vulnerable in a way that Lou Reed was never supposed to be vulnerable. The audience sat in stunned silence, some thinking this was the greatest performance they had ever witnessed, others uncomfortable with such naked emotion from a man whose entire career had been built on cool detachment and ironic distance. But Reed wasn't performing anymore. He was confessing, and the confession was directed not at the audience, but at someone who wasn't there. Someone he had failed in ways he was only now beginning to fully comprehend. The breakdown point came during the bridge. Reed's voice failed completely on the line about it being such a perfect day. The words caught in his throat. His fingers momentarily lost their place on the guitar, and for several seconds, the only sound in the venue was the ambient noise of 1,500 people holding their collective breath. Lou's guitar tech later said that he almost walked on stage, convinced something was medically wrong, but Reed's tour manager grabbed his arm and shook his head. They had to let this happen. Lou needed this to happen. And slowly, painfully, Reed gathered himself and continued. His voice was raw now, stripped of all the technical control and artistic distance that usually characterized his performances. He was just a man singing a song about a day that had seemed perfect, but was built on foundations that were already crumbling. A relationship that was already doomed, not because the love wasn't real, but because Lou had never learned how to sustain love without sabotaging it. What made the performance even more devastating was what the audience couldn't hear. The backstage context that Reed's closest associates would later reluctantly share. The phone call hadn't just brought news about Rachel. It had included details about Rachel's life after Lou, the struggles with addiction that mirrored his own, the discrimination and violence that transgender people faced in the 70s and 80s, the survival sex work and the disappearances and the desperate attempts to maintain dignity in a world that offered none. And it had included one more detail, one that his tour manager said hit Lou like a physical blow. Rachel had kept a photograph of the two of them, taken during happier times, in whatever temporary living situation she had ended up in. A photograph that Rachel had shown to people as proof that once, for a brief moment, she had been loved by someone famous, someone important, even if that person had eventually discarded her. Reed finished "Perfect Day" somehow. The final chord hung in the air longer than it should have, sustained by his unwillingness to let go of the moment, to return to the present where he would have to face what he had learned and what he was feeling. When his hand finally lifted from the guitar, the silence in the venue was profound. Then the applause started, tentative at first, then building to something that sounded less like appreciation and more like collective catharsis. The audience knew they had witnessed something unrepeatable, a moment when the barrier between performer and person had completely dissolved. What they couldn't know was that this wasn't entertainment. This was grief. Lou didn't speak after the song ended. He simply picked up his electric guitar and launched into the next number, something faster and harder and more aggressive, using volume and distortion to rebuild the walls that Perfect Day had torn down. But everyone who was in that venue later agreed. Something had fundamentally changed. The rest of the concert was technically proficient, but emotionally distant. Reed retreating back into his persona because the alternative, staying in that raw, wounded space, was unbearable. When the show ended and Lou left the stage, he went directly to his dressing room and locked the door. The tour manager stood outside for 2 hours before Reed finally emerged, eyes red, face pale, but composed in that artificial way that suggested enormous effort being expended to appear normal. The story of that Berlin performance might have remained just another rock and roll legend, a tale passed between fans about the night Lou Reed cried on stage, if not for what happened next. Reed made a decision that night that would alter the final chapter of his life. He instructed his management to locate Rachel, to use whatever resources were necessary to find her and offer help, financial support, anything she needed. It was too little, too late. The kind of gesture that couldn't undo decades of absence and couldn't repair the damage that had been done. But it was something, and for Lou Reed, who had spent his life refusing to apologize or explain or justify, it represented a fundamental shift. Rachel was eventually found, and what transpired between them in the final years before Reed's death in 2013 remained intensely private. Protected by the few people who knew with a loyalty that spoke to how seriously Lou took the matter. The deeper truth about that Berlin breakdown, the piece that connects to the broader tragedy of Reed's life, reaches back to those electroshock treatments he endured as a teenager. His parents, terrified by his bisexual feelings and convinced by 1950s psychiatric orthodoxy that such things could be cured, had subjected their son to a barbaric procedure that damaged his memory and traumatized him in ways that would echo through every relationship he ever had. Lou learned early that being himself was dangerous, that love was something that could be used to hurt you, that trust was a weapon that would eventually be turned against you. Is it any wonder that when he finally found someone like Rachel, someone who understood marginalization and otherness and the courage required to be yourself in a hostile world, he simultaneously clung to that relationship and sabotaged it? The electroshock had taught him that intimacy leads to punishment, and no amount of intellectual understanding could completely override that fundamental programming. Rachel represented everything Lou had been taught to fear and everything he actually needed. Authenticity, vulnerability, the courage to be visibly different in a world that demanded conformity. Their relationship was intense, chaotic, fueled by drugs and art and mutual recognition. But it was also terrifying for Reed in ways he could never fully articulate. When the factory scene dissolved and the 70s turned into the 80s and Lou's career required reinvention, Rachel became inconvenient. Not because the love had ended, but because acknowledging that love, maintaining that relationship, meant continuing to be vulnerable in ways that frightened him. So he did what trauma survivors often do. He protected himself by destroying what he loved. He cut Rachel out of his life completely, refused to speak about their time together, and tried to bury that part of his history as if it had never happened. But you can't bury love, and you can't bury guilt, and eventually, both will find their way back to the surface. The phone call in Berlin was the return of the repressed, the past demanding acknowledgement after decades of willful forgetting, and Perfect Day, that song he had performed hundreds of times without incident, became the vehicle for everything he had been trying not to feel. The tears that night weren't about the beauty of the song or the quality of the melody. They were about Rachel, about the electroshock treatments that had made him afraid of his own heart, about the perfect days that had existed and been lost not through fate, but through choice, through fear, through the learned inability to sustain the very things that made life worth living. The audience witnessed a breakdown, but what they really saw was a breaking through, a moment when all of Lou's defenses failed, and the truth of who he was and what he had done stood exposed under the stage lights. Reed's final years, lived with the visual artist Laurie Anderson, showed a man trying to make peace with his past and build something different for his future. He practiced Tai Chi, embraced meditation, spoke more openly about his life and his mistakes. The aggressive, confrontational persona softened, though it never completely disappeared. And somewhere in those final years, in conversations that will never be fully documented, Lou Reed faced what he had done to Rachel and tried, inadequately but genuinely, to make amends. It couldn't undo the hurt or reclaim the lost years, but it represented a kind of growth that would have been unthinkable for the younger Lou. The man who turned pain into armor and wore that armor every waking moment. When Reed died in 2013 from complications of liver disease, the result of decades of hard living finally catching up with him, the obituaries celebrated the Velvet Underground, the solo hits, the influence on punk and alternative rock. They mentioned his marriage to Laurie Anderson and his late-life artistic collaborations. Some mentioned Rachel in passing, a footnote in the larger story of Lou's complex personal life. But the truth of what Rachel meant to him, what that Berlin performance revealed about his capacity for love and his struggle with vulnerability, remained largely hidden. Perhaps that's fitting. Lou Reed spent his life controlling his narrative, deciding what to reveal and what to conceal. But that night in Berlin, for the length of one song, the narrative escaped his control and the truth emerged. He was not just the cool, untouchable poet of New York's underbelly, but a damaged man who had loved and failed and carried that failure with him for decades, until it finally demanded recognition in the most public way possible. The legacy of that performance lives in the bootleg recordings that circulate among serious Reed collectors, in the testimony of those who were there, and in the way it reframes our understanding of Perfect Day itself. The song can never be just a simple love song again, not when we know what it cost Lou to sing it that night, what memories it summoned, what regrets it embodied. It stands now as something more complex and more human. A perfect day remembered through the lens of imperfect choices. A moment of beauty shadowed by the knowledge of what came after. A love song that is also a confession and an apology and a recognition that some wounds, no matter how many years pass, never fully heal. They just wait for the moment when our defenses are down and force us to finally fully feel them.